The Blackwood Pack altar was an immense slab of ancient granite, carved from the deep bones of the mountain and stained with the history of 1,000 generations. Tonight, it was supposed to be a place of sacred union. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine, wet earth, and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching blizzard. Hundreds of wolves stood in silent reverence around the courtyard, their breath plumbing in the freezing autumn air, waiting for the ceremony to begin. At the center of the day stood Elyra. She wore a simple, unadorned gown of white linen, the thin fabric offering no protection against the biting wind that whipped across the stone. She did not shiver. Her calloused hands rested gently, almost unconsciously, over her lower abdomen. There, safely hidden beneath the coarse linen, a tiny spark of life was growing. She was pregnant with the Alpha King's heir. She had kept the secret for 3 arduous weeks, enduring the whispers and the grueling labor of the lower castes, waiting for this exact night to offer the revelations as a sacred, binding gift under the light of the full moon. Draven emerged from the heavy oak doors of the keep, and the collective heartbeat of the pack seemed to stutter. The Alpha King was a terrifying vision of martial power, his massive frame wrapped in dark wolf furs and boiled leather. His winter storm eyes swept over the gathered crowd, projecting an aura of absolute, unfeeling authority. But as his gaze landed on the quiet woman at the altar, there was no warmth, no flicker of the fated recognition that had once burned between them in the dark. His expression was a wall of impenetrable ice, and he was not walking alone. Just a half step behind the sovereign walked Maria. Elyra's own sister wore a gown of exquisite crimson silk, the rich, heavy fabric catching the torchlight like fresh blood against the snow. The cloying scent of sweet gardenia rolled off the high-born woman, a practiced perfume deliberately crafted to mask the toxic rot of her ambition. Maria's lips curved into a sweet, demure smile that did not reach her calculating eyes. The pack elder stepped forward, raising his wooden staff to call upon the moon goddess. Draven held up a single gauntleted hand, cutting the old man off instantly. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute, suffocating, heavy as a collapsed lung. Before the ancestors and the moon, Draven announced, his voice echoing across the freezing stone with the clinical, merciless detachment of an executioner. I reject Elyra of the Vance line as my mate. The words struck the pregnant woman with the physical force of a bludgeon. Elyra gasped, her fingers digging frantically into the thin linen over her womb. The crescent-shaped claiming mark on her delicate wrist, a brand that had throbbed with a low, comforting heat for weeks, suddenly flared with the searing agony of frostbite. The fated bond did not merely break, it shattered into jagged shards of ice that tore through her nervous system. A cavernous, hollow void opened behind her ribs, an agonizing absence where her magic and her tether to the earth had once resided. The cold numbed her skin, her fingers, her face, but it could not touch the frozen wasteland rapidly spreading through her chest. The pack ceremony was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, it became the moment Elyra Vance's entire world shattered. She could not breathe. She could not speak. The sudden severing of a fated mate bond was known to kill weaker wolves, stopping their hearts in a single beat of unimaginable torment. Elyra felt her pulse stutter, fighting against the sudden, crushing pressure of a reality that had just tilted off its axis. The hollow mark on her skin didn't just contain her rejection, it created a void, an absence where her internal warmth should be, draining her physical vitality by the second. Draven did not so much as flinch as the color completely drained from the fragile woman's face. He turned his broad shoulders toward the stunned crowd, his voice carrying easily over the rising howl of the wind. "In her place," the Alpha King continued, his tone devoid of any hesitation or regret, "I claim Maria as my true mate and the rightful Luna of the Blackwood Pack. She possesses the pristine bloodline and the unbroken strength required to stand beside me." Maria stepped forward, her smile widening into a blade of pure, malicious triumph. She laced her fingers intimately through the tall ruler's hand, resting her perfectly coiffed head against his fur-draped shoulder. Elyra stared at the two of them, the physical pain of the severed bond driving her to her knees in her mind, though her body remained stubbornly, defiantly upright. She would not let them see her break. She would not let the sister who had tormented her for years witness her total ruin. Draven finally looked back at the discarded woman standing alone on the dais. "The ring," he commanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous, low growl that vibrated through the stones. "Surrender it." Elyra slowly raised her left hand, the Blackwood moon ring, a heavy, ancient silver band set with a cold, milky moonstone, caught the shifting moonlight. He had slid it onto her finger in the dark, whispering breathless promises against her skin that no one else was ever allowed to hear. Now, the metal felt like a parasitic weight, freezing the blood in her trembling fingers. The gathered wolves held their breath. They fully expected the broken Omega to collapse. They expected her to weep, to scream, to crawl across the freezing granite and plead for the scraps of his mercy. But Elyra did not cry. Her strength was not loud, aggressive, or violent. It was rooted in a quiet, terrifying restraint. She slipped the heavy silver band over her pale knuckle. With a simple flick of her wrist, she let it fall. The heavy ring struck the stone altar with a sharp, ringing clatter that sounded like a cracked bell in the dead silence. She did not say a single word. She did not offer a single tear to the man who had just destroyed her life. Elyra simply turned her back on the Alpha King, stepping off the dais and walking straight toward the open iron gates of the fortress. The crowd parted for her as if she were a plague-bearing ghost, stepping back from the terrifying emptiness radiating from her small frame. The wind immediately tore at her white gown, but she kept her head bowed, her arms wrapped fiercely around her stomach, walking out into the black, blizzard-swept night. She vanished into the freezing storm, carrying the only secret that still mattered. The road, leading away from the Blackwood territory, was treacherous, even in the height of summer, a winding, jagged path that cut straight up into the lethal teeth of the Obsidian peaks. Tonight, swallowed by a supernatural, howling blizzard, it was an absolute death sentence. Elyra did not care. She walked through knee-deep snow until her muscles screamed in agony, and then she walked further still. The thin linen gown that had marked her as a Luna was now soaked completely through, freezing to her fragile skin like a layer of solid ice. The jagged, unforgiving stones hidden beneath the deep powder sliced mercilessly into her bare feet, leaving a faint, desperate trail of crimson droplets in her wake. She wrapped her arms tighter around her swelling abdomen, ordering, curling her shoulders inward to press whatever remaining body heat she possessed directly into her womb. The physical toll of the severed mate bond was a constant, throbbing drumbeat of agony behind her ribs, a violent reminder of the man who had discarded her. Every shallow breath drew knives of freezing air into her burning lungs. Every heavy heartbeat pumped icy, sluggish blood through veins that felt entirely hollowed out. The crescent mark on her wrist had faded from a vibrant brand to a sickly, bruised purple, radiating a sickening numbness that threatened to drag her down into the snow with every staggering step. She could not stop. If she stopped, Draven's calculated cruelty would win. If she stopped, the tiny, innocent life flickering bravely inside her would be extinguished before it ever had the chance to see the morning sun. She pushed forward, leaning her entire weight against the frozen, scarred bark of the ancient pines, her vision swimming with dark, encroaching shadows. Just a little further, she whispered down to the child, her lips cracked and bleeding from the unrelenting wind. "I will keep you safe. I promise you, little one. I will not let the cold take you." But the elements were entirely merciless. The blizzard howled through the canyon like a pack of starving, feral beasts, battering her small, exhausted frame with unrelenting violence. Her knees finally buckled under the impossible strain. Elyra collapsed into a deep, shifting snowdrift, her body hitting the freezing ground with a dull, helpless thud. She tried to push herself back up, her trembling, frost-bitten fingers digging frantically into the powder, but her physical strength was completely gone. She was fading rapidly, like a candle running out of wax, the bitter winter frost seeping deep into her marrow and extinguishing the last desperate sparks of her willpower. She curled into a tight, protective ball, shielding her stomach with her frozen arms, and squeezed her eyes shut. The ice formed a fault line across her consciousness, cracking violently under the immense pressure of her sheer physical exhaustion. Then, the world abruptly changed. The deafening, chaotic roar of the blizzard was suddenly and violently silenced, replaced by the deafening sound of a massive atmospheric displacement. The wind did not just die, it was physically pushed away by a force of unimaginable magnitude. A colossal, heavy shadow fell over the snowdrift, completely blotting out the swirling grey clouds and the faint, mocking moonlight. Elyra forced her heavy eyelids open, her breath catching in her frozen throat. Above her, hovering in the violently displaced sky, was a creature of myth, legend, and absolute terror. The legendary dragon emperor had descended. Valerin Drake was a magnificent, terrifying behemoth of obsidian scales and molten gold armor, his massive leathery wings spanning the entire width of the narrow mountain pass. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his colossal form hit the frozen ground like a physical wave of midsummer fire. The deep snow surrounding Elyra's shivering body instantly melted, turning the frozen, hostile earth into warm, steaming, sanctuary soil. The massive dragon landed with an earth-shattering tremor that rattled the very bones of the mountain, folding his massive wings forward to form an impenetrable, domed canopy that completely shielded her from the storm. Elyra stared up in helpless terror, expecting the apex predator to finish what the winter cold had started. Instead, the colossal dragon lowered his massive horned head with agonizing, deliberate slowness. His eyes, burning like deep pools of liquid, molten gold, locked onto her fragile, trembling form. There was no cruelty in that gaze. There was no arrogance, no demand for submission. There was only a profound, ancient, and absolute reverence. The freezing air shimmered with intense, rippling heat, and in a sudden, silent flash of blinding golden light, the beast dissolved. Stepping out of the rising steam was a man who commanded the very sky itself. Valerin was impossibly tall, clad in deep obsidian silks and heavy battle armor that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. His long silver hair whipped fiercely around a face carved from harsh, unforgiving stone, but his expression as he looked down at the freezing woman was entirely undone. He did not posture. He did not stand over her to demand her obedience. The most powerful sovereign in 3 realms immediately dropped to his knees in the wet, melted earth, utterly uncaring of the mud staining his pristine royal garments. He reached out with large, impossibly warm hands, hesitating for a fraction of a second to ensure he did not frighten her, before gently, reverently gathering her freezing body into his broad chest. The contrast was staggering. Where Draven's touch had always carried the underlying threat of violence, possession, and control, Valerin's touch was an absolute unconditional sanctuary. A wave of pure, radiant solar magic flowed seamlessly from his skin into hers, instantly thawing the lethal ice in her veins and wrapping her pregnant womb in a cocoon of unyielding, fiercely protective warmth. Elyra gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock, her stiff hands instinctively clutching the fine fabric of his pet's dark silk tunic. The sudden, overwhelming influx of his heat made her dormant blood sing in response, a faint answering spark of golden light momentarily flickering beneath her pale, frost-bitten skin. Valerin's molten gold eyes widened fractionally as he felt the undeniable resonance of her hidden, divine lineage. He pulled her closer, burying his harsh face in the frozen, damp strands of her hair. His massive frame actually trembled, not with the ambient cold, but with an overwhelming, feral, protective instinct that defied all political logic. "I have you," the Dragon Emperor murmured, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated steadily against her chest, grounding her entirely in the present moment. "Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me." He stood effortlessly, lifting her weight against his heart, as if she were made of nothing but spun glass and starlight. Elyra did not struggle. The agonizing, sharp pain of the severed wolf bond was suddenly muted, completely drowned out by the overwhelming, sensory safety of the dragon's embrace. She closed her eyes, letting the radiating heat of his body pull her back from the terrifying edge of death, completely unaware that the sovereign holding her was about to wage an apocalyptic war against the entire world, simply to ensure she never felt cold again. Consciousness returned not with a violent jolt, but as a slow, deliberate upward drift through layers of liquid warmth. Elyra did not open her eyes immediately. For the past 3 weeks, waking up had meant facing the biting, damp chill of the lower caste quarters. It had meant bracing her pregnant body against the inevitable aches of hard labor and the suffocating anxiety of keeping her secret from the pack. But the brutal, freezing air of the mountain pass was entirely gone. The howling wind that had threatened to tear the fragile life from her womb had been completely silenced. Instead, she was entirely enveloped in an ambient, humming heat that felt as though it was radiating directly from the very marrow of the earth. She lay perfectly still, her senses slowly cataloguing this impossible reality. The surface beneath her was not a thin, straw-stuffed pallet, but a massive expanse of impossibly soft material. Heavy, spun silk sheets draped over her delicate frame, lined with a thick, insulating velvet that smelled faintly of cedar, wood smoke, and a deep, sun-baked earth. Her first conscious, panicked thought was for the innocent life growing inside her. Her eyes snapped open, a sharp gasp tearing through her throat, as her calloused hands flew instinctively to her lower abdomen. The sheer terror of the blizzard crashed over her memory, threatening to drag her back into the ice. But as her trembling fingers pressed gently against the fine linen of her new garments, she felt it. A tiny, definitive flutter, a quiet, resilient shift of movement right beneath her palms. The child was safe. Elyra let out a ragged, breathless exhale, her shoulders sagging into the mountain of soft pillows behind her. The fierce maternal panic that had driven her through the lethal snowstorm began to recede, replaced by a profound, overwhelming wave of absolute relief. She was alive. Her baby had survived the darkest night of their lives. She slowly turned her gaze to her left wrist, dreading the visual confirmation of her total ruin, the fated claiming mark that her former mate had given her in the dark, the crescent moon that had shattered into jagged, agonizing ice at the altar, was no longer a gaping spiritual wound. The skin was completely smooth, though the shape of the crescent remained as a muted, faded scar, pale and lifeless. The cavernous, hollow void that had opened behind her ribs during the rejection was no longer draining her vitality. Instead, a strange, persistent golden warmth seemed to pulse faintly beneath her sternum, naturally filling the empty space where the wolf bond had once resided. It felt like a dormant ember slowly coming back to life, feeding off the ambient energy of the room. She finally allowed herself to look around. The chamber she rested in defied all logic of the brutal northern territories. The walls were constructed from smooth, dark basalt, intricately veined with natural rivers of raw, glowing gold that provided a soft, ambient illumination. Immense arched windows, completely devoid of glass, opened directly out into a breathtaking expanse of endless blue sky. Fluffy, brilliant white clouds drifted lazily far beneath the wide window ledges. She was not just high in the mountains, she was resting inside a sky-bound citadel, a floating volcanic fortress suspended entirely above the harsh reality of the world she had known. The heavy, carved mahogany doors at the far end of the vast chamber unlatched with a soft metallic click. Elyra stiffened, her spine going rigid as the ingrained instincts of an outcast immediately took over. She pulled the thick silk blankets defensively over her swelling belly, preparing herself for a harsh command, a sneer of disgust, or the cruel backhand of a superior. The man who stepped through the doorway was the most terrifying, majestic creature she had ever seen. He was no longer clad in the intimidating, molten gold battle armor that had shielded her from the storm. Instead, the sovereign wore simple, loose-fitting tunics of dark obsidian silk that draped effortlessly over his colossal, muscular frame. His long silver hair caught the ambient light of the room, framing a face carved with harsh, predatory angles. But there was no aggression in his posture. His movements were painstakingly slow, deliberate, and remarkably quiet for a man of his staggering size. He stopped several paces away from the foot of the massive bed, intentionally keeping a vast distance between them so she would not feel cornered. His burning, liquid gold eyes swept over her pale face, searching for any sign of lingering distress, any shadow of pain. Elyra didn't know that the man standing in the doorway had buried 3 women who dared to love him. She had no idea that the Dragon Emperor carried a history steeped in tragic destruction, a lineage cursed by its own overwhelming magnitude. He looked at her not as a captive, but as a fragile, irreplaceable artifact that he was utterly terrified of breaking. "You are awake," Valerin murmured, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate pleasantly through the basalt floors and into her very bones. The tone was completely devoid of the sharp, commanding edge that Alpha Kings always used to demand attention. It was an earnest, gentle observation, heavy with unspoken relief. He held a small, silver tray, carrying a crystal goblet of water and a bowl of fresh, vibrantly colored fruits that the young woman had never seen before. In the bitter northern winters, he did not order her to eat. He simply took 3 slow steps forward and placed the tray gently on the polished stone table beside the bed before immediately retreating a step back to respect her boundaries. Elyra started, her voice cracking slightly from the lingering dryness in her throat. She cleared it, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with the apex predator. She would not cower. "Where am I?" "You are safe," the massive man replied, his golden eyes unwavering. "You are in the Obsidian Fortress, high above the peaks. The storm cannot reach you here. Nothing can reach you here unless you permit it." The concept of absolute safety was so profoundly alien to the outcast that she simply stared at him in quiet disbelief. In her former life, safety was a temporary illusion, an asset that could be revoked at the whim of the ruling class. She waited for the condition. She waited for the sovereign to name his price for rescuing a discarded, pregnant Omega from the ice. "Why?" she finally whispered, her fingers twisting nervously into the luxurious silk of the blankets. "I am nothing. I have nothing to offer a dragon court." "Why did you save me?" The broad chest of the sovereign rose with a slow, heavy breath. He slowly sank to his knees right there on the hard stone floor, lowering his massive height until his eyes were entirely level with hers. It was a gesture of such profound, unhesitating submission that Elyra felt her breath catch in her throat. Kings did not kneel. Rulers of empires did not lower themselves before broken Omegas. Because when the world tried to erase you, you did not beg, and you did not surrender, Valerin answered, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper. Because true strength is not loud, little one. It is quiet, it is enduring. You protected the life within you against impossible odds. You do not owe me anything. You are here solely because you deserve a sanctuary. The absolute sincerity in his words struck a chord deep within her battered soul. She stared at the kneeling monarch, searching for a trace of the manipulative deceit that had characterized her sister's smile, or the cruel arrogance of the man who had cast her out. There was none. There was only a fierce, unconditional protective instinct radiating from his massive frame, warming the air between them. Before Elyra could find the words to respond to such an overwhelming declaration, a soft knock echoed from the open doorway. The Emperor smoothly rose to his feet, his demeanor shifting instantly from vulnerable reverence back to an imposing, composed guardian. He turned his head slightly, nodding toward the corridor. A woman stepped into the sunlit chamber. She was older, her face lined with the deep, beautiful wisdom of a long life well lived. She wore flowing robes of deep crimson and rich gold, the traditional colors of the highest medical caste in the dragon realm. A comforting, earthy scent immediately followed her, bringing a blend of dried sage, sun-baked clay, and sweet healing resins into the room. "This is Gwyneth Cole," Valerin introduced softly, gesturing to the older woman. "She is the chief healer of the Obsidian Court. I asked her to wait outside until you woke. She will only examine you if you give her your explicit consent." The word echoed strangely in the young woman's mind. In the pack hierarchy, a physician did not ask for permission to handle a lower caste member. They simply prodded, pulled, and commanded. To be offered a choice regarding her own body was yet another staggering revelation in this floating sanctuary. Elyra looked from the massive sovereign to the gentle-eyed healer. She slowly nodded her head, pulling the blankets back just enough to expose her arms and the curve of her linen-clad stomach. "Please," she whispered. Gwyneth approached the bed with measured, unhurried steps. She did not carry the harsh, metallic instruments of the wolf physicians. Her tools were entirely internal. She smiled warmly at the fragile survivor, a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes with genuine maternal kindness. "You have had a terribly long night, my dear," the older woman murmured, her voice like a soothing melody. She rubbed her own hands together, generating a soft, ambient friction before holding them an inch above the patient's abdomen. She did not press down. She simply allowed her palms to hover, closing her eyes as she reached out with her diagnostic magic. A sensation of pure, concentrated summer sunlight spread from the healer's hands, washing over Elyra's skin and sinking deep into her tired muscles. It was an incredibly intimate, sensory experience, entirely devoid of pain or invasive pressure. The pregnant woman closed her eyes, letting the beautiful, melodic hum of the medical spell soothe her frayed nerves. After several long moments, Gwyneth let out a soft, delighted laugh. She pulled her hands back and opened her eyes, beaming down at the bed. "The little one is a fierce fighter," the healer announced, her voice thick with joyful reverence. "Despite the lethal drop in your body temperature, and despite the traumatic severing of your previous spiritual tether, the child is perfectly healthy. Its heartbeat is strong, steady, and remarkably resilient. You shielded it beautifully." A single, hot tear finally broke free from Elyra's eyelashes, tracing a silent path down her pale cheek. She did not weep when her world was destroyed. She did not cry when the man she loved humiliated her before the ancestors. But the absolute confirmation that her baby had survived the nightmare broke the dam of her quiet restraint. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand, letting out a small, breathless sob of pure, unadulterated relief. Valerin took a half-step forward, his massive hands twitching at his sides, as if fighting the overwhelming urge to pull her into his chest and physically shield her from her own tears. He forced himself to remain exactly where he was, anchoring her with his steady, protective presence rather than crowding her space. "But there is something else," Gwyneth continued, her tone shifting from gentle reassurance to a hushed, awestruck reverence. The older woman reached out, lightly tracing a finger over the air above the faded claiming scar, before moving her hand to hover directly over the center of her patient's chest. The ambient golden light, veining the basalt walls of the chamber, suddenly seemed to flare in direct response to the healer's focused attention. The humming heat in the room intensified rapidly, wrapping around Elyra like a warm, physical embrace. "What is it?" the Emperor demanded, his deep voice instantly tight with intense concern, his protective instincts flaring at the slight change in the medical atmosphere. "Is she injured? Is there lingering frost in her marrow?" "No, Your Majesty," the healer replied, shaking her head slowly. She looked up, meeting the liquid gold gaze of her sovereign before looking back down at the confused outcast. It is not an injury. It is an awakening. Gwyneth gently placed 2 fingers against Elyra's sternum. The moment her skin made contact, a brilliant, undeniable spark of molten golden light bloomed beneath the young woman's flesh. It pulsed outward in a mesmerizing, rippling wave, illuminating her veins with a radiant, cosmic fire before settling back into a steady, hidden glow. Elyra gasped, feeling a sudden surge of physical vitality rush through her tired limbs, completely erasing the last lingering traces of her profound exhaustion. "Your former mate called you a defective wolf," the older woman said, her voice trembling with the heavy weight of ancient history. "He believed your inability to shift, your quiet nature, and your lack of feral aggression were signs of a broken lineage. He was entirely, foolishly blind." Elyra stared at the glowing patch of skin on her chest, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. For her entire life, she had been told she was less than nothing. She had been relegated to the shadows, forced to scrub stone floors and serve honeyed wine because her wolf spirit was entirely silent, a dormant void that refused to answer the call of the moon. "I do not understand," she whispered, her voice shaking as she looked up at the healer. "I have no magic. I am just a useless Omega." "You are no mere Omega, my child," Gwyneth corrected gently, her eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute wonder. "The reason your body could not harbor a traditional wolf spirit, the reason the heavy silver ring felt like parasitic ice on your skin, is because a vessel can only hold what it was designed for. You could never channel the cold magic of the moon, because you carry the dormant, supreme lineage of the sun." The revelation hung in the warm, cedar-scented air, heavy with world-altering implications. "A cosmic solar dragon bloodline," the healer continued, her words painting a picture of impossible majesty. "An ancient, divine magic that has been entirely suppressed by the damp, freezing environment of the northern Packlands. It was slowly suffocating inside you. When that arrogant king severed the fated tether, he did not destroy you. He accidentally unsealed the vault. He freed you." Elyra could barely comprehend the sheer magnitude of the words. She looked desperately toward the foot of the bed, seeking a tether in the overwhelming storm of new information. Valerin was staring at her, his harsh predatory features completely softened by a look of breathtaking awe. The ambient energy of the sky-bound citadel was not just keeping her warm. It was actively recognizing her blood. The volcanic heat, the endless altitude, the proximity to the Dragon Emperor himself, it was all acting as a massive catalyst, calling out to the ancient, radiant power sleeping in her veins. "The child you carry," Gwyneth whispered, taking Elyra's trembling hand and pressing it gently back against her womb. "It is not just a wolf heir. It is drawing upon your inherent solar magic. It is adapting, evolving into something far more powerful than the man who carelessly discarded it. You belong here, in the heights, where the sun touches the ancient stone. The cavernous ache of betrayal, the agonizing humiliation of being cast aside for a manipulative rival, suddenly felt incredibly small and distant. The narrative of her life had been violently rewritten in a single morning. She was not a pathetic victim who had crawled into the snow to die quietly in the dark. She was a dormant star that had finally been given the vast, endless sky to burn in. Valerin took another slow step forward, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering devotion that made her newly awakened blood sing in profound, undeniable resonance. He still did not touch her, but his massive presence enveloped her completely, offering a silent promise of absolute, uncompromising sovereign protection. "You will never scrub another floor," the Emperor vowed, his voice a low, rumbling oath that seemed to seal itself permanently into the very foundation of the floating fortress. "You will never bow your head in shame to a lesser king. You will heal, you will learn the true depth of your fire, and you will reign." Elyra looked down at her hands, no longer seeing the call-used, bruised fingers of a discarded servant, but the delicate, trembling vessel of an ancient, undeniable power. The deep, agonizing cold was permanently gone, banished forever by the radiant, soaring heat of a majestic destiny she was finally ready to claim. The unnatural winter did not break. Instead, it sank its icy teeth deeper into the bedrock rock of the Blackwood Pack territory. 5 agonizing months had passed since the mating ceremony at the Pack altar, where the Alpha King severed a fated tether for sheer political ambition. Now, the once lush pine forests snapped under the crushing weight of unrelenting ice, ancient timber splintering like massive brittle bones. The rushing rivers had frozen solid, trapping fish beneath impenetrable frost. A suffocating silence descended over the lower quarters, where shivering wolves huddled around dying hearths, their bellies hollow and their spirits entirely broken. Alpha King Draven Thornwood sat upon his ancestral granite throne, wrapped in triple layers of heavy bear pelts, yet unable to banish the chill settled into his marrow. His winterstorm eyes were bloodshot from restless insomnia. He had expected the public rejection to liberate him. He had expected his inner wolf to roar with the feral power of a high-born Luna by his side. Instead, a cavernous, screaming void remained locked behind his ribs, clawing at the inside of his sternum. Every time he tried to shift to patrol the dying borders, the beast whimpered, violently rejecting the freezing reality of a mateless existence. It was a persistent, throbbing ache that drained his vitality with every shallow breath. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a howling gust of snow. Maria Vance stomped into the throne room, draped in crimson silks and thick winter pelts. Her beautiful face was pinched tight with a petty, relentless grievance. The cloying scent of sweet gardenia that always preceded her had turned stale. In the unyielding cold of the dying fortress, her perfume soured into something that smelled faintly of rotting flowers, left to decay on a frost-bitten grave. "This is completely intolerable, Draven," the high-born woman snapped, her voice sharp and grating, lacking the soothing resonance a true Pack mother was supposed to project. She marched up the stone steps of the dais, aggressively holding out her left hand. The Blackwood moonring hung awkwardly on her slender finger. The heavy silver band and its milky moonstone looked less like a sacred symbol of royalty and more like a parasitic shackle. The metal was actively rejecting her, maintaining a sub-zero temperature that left the delicate skin of her knuckle bruised and raw, yet her sheer vanity refused to let her take it off. "The fires in the upper chambers keep dying out before midnight," Maria complained bitterly, crossing her arms as she glared at her mate. "The servants are entirely useless, moving like half-dead corpses, and the kitchens dared to serve me salted, dried venison again this morning. I am the Luna of the most powerful territory in the north. I demand fresh meat, and I demand the eastern halls be properly heated immediately." Draven's jaw clenched. A low, dangerous growl vibrated in the back of his throat, born of exhausting frustration. When her sister had silently managed the lower courts, he had never heard a single complaint about the dropping temperatures. The outcast had scrubbed the stone floors, tended the massive hearths, and ensured the fortress was wrapped in a quiet, unassuming warmth. He had foolishly mistaken her silence for weakness. He had thought her lack of feral aggression meant she was genetically flawed. Now, the deafening noise of Maria's constant demands was driving his inner beast to the brink of violent madness. "There is no fresh meat," the Alpha King replied flatly, his voice echoing off the frost-coated tapestries. "The herds have fled the valleys. The hunting grounds are completely barren." Before the woman could launch into another shrill tirade, an elder stepped cautiously out of the deep shadows near the granite pillars. The old man was grey-muzzled, his spine curved from age and visibly trembling from the creeping chill that permeated the stone. "Alpha," the elder murmured, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. He kept his head respectfully bowed, though his hands shook uncontrollably around his wooden staff. "The southern ranging parties have finally returned from the borders. Their sleds are empty, The soil across the primary agricultural basin is frozen 3 feet deep into the permafrost. The winter wheat we planted for the spring harvest is entirely dead. The roots have turned to black ash under the frost. Draven stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the dying embers. "The Blackwood lands have never suffered a famine of this magnitude," he rumbled. "Not even during the Great Eclipse. The pack's ancestral magic is tied to the lunar. It is supposed to inherently protect the soil and ensure the survival of the prey." He turned his burning, accusatory glare toward the crimson-clad woman standing beside his throne. Maria shrank back slightly, her haughty demeanor faltering under the sheer weight of a sovereign's desperate anger. She clutched the freezing ring on her finger, her eyes darting nervously toward the elder. The old man swallowed hard, terrified of the lethal truth he carried, but the impending starvation of his people left him no choice. "The magic is gone, Alpha." The deep, nurturing warmth that sustained our valleys did not come from the earth itself. It did not come from the royal title, and it does not come from that ring. "Explain yourself," Draven commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal vibrating whisper that warned of imminent violence. "It came from her," the elder breathed, his voice cracking with the heavy weight of ancestral regret. "We looked right through the girl who poured our wine. We called her defective because she could not shift into a wolfhood to run with the hunting parties. But she carried the sun in her collused hands. Every dying plant she touched thrived. Every hearth she tended burned twice as hot, resisting the deepest winter drafts. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with." The proverb hung in the freezing air, a devastatingly accurate indictment of their collective blindness. "When you cast Elyra out onto the ice," the old man continued, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled cheeks and freezing in his beard, "you cast out the very season of spring. The land is not simply experiencing a harsh winter. The land is violently mourning her absence. It is freezing from the inside out because its beating heart has been cut out of its chest." "Lies," Maria shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, defensive panic. She was a broken, useless servant. She died in the snow months ago, rotting at the bottom of a ravine. The land is simply testing my strength, and you are all too weak to endure it." But the Alpha King was no longer listening to the shrieks of his new mate. A sudden, terrifying realization crashed over his consciousness, physicalized by a piercing spasm deep within his chest. The severed fated bond shouldn't still hurt this much if the other half of his soul had truly perished. If Elyra had died in the unforgiving blizzard, the spiritual void behind his ribs should have eventually scarred over, leaving a dull, permanent numbness. Instead, as he focused all his heightened senses inward, he felt it, deep within the agonizing absence. Beneath the thick layers of his own regret, there was a faint, impossible vibration. It was a pulse of distant, radiant warmth that absolutely did not belong to a frozen corpse. She was not dead. Somewhere, far beyond the lethal teeth of the northern mountains, the discarded Omega was not just surviving. She was thriving with such immense, uncontainable power that the sheer magnitude of her survival was actively draining the residual life magic from his own dying territory. Draven looked down at his trembling hands. The Alpha King had made a catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation. He had thrown away the only true source of light his kingdom possessed. He had to find her. He had to track that distant, pulsing warmth to the ends of the earth and drag his rightful property back, or his entire empire would be buried under the snow forever, far above the suffocating ice of the northern territories. An entirely different world flourished in breathtaking defiance of the season. The Obsidian Fortress drifted majestically in a sea of endless, radiant azure sky. Here, high above the clouds, there was no biting frost. The floating islands were connected by ancient bridges of woven starlight and dark iron hovering effortlessly in the stratosphere. Far below, one could glimpse the thick storm clouds burying the oppressive wolf lands, But up here, the air was crystalline and pure. There was only the unfiltered heat of the sun baking the smooth volcanic stones, and the sweet, intoxicating scent of massive, blooming flora cascading brilliantly over the high terraces. Elyra Vance walked barefoot across the warm, sunlit basalt path of the Imperial Sky Gardens. 5 months of absolute, unconditional sanctuary had wrought a staggering physical transformation. She was no longer the fragile, shivering servant girl hiding her deep bruises beneath coarse linen. She wore flowing silks of pale gold and deep crimson, the rich fabrics draping beautifully over the pronounced curve of her pregnant belly. Her pale skin glowed with a vibrant, healthy flush, and her silver hair cascaded down her back in thick waves that caught the sunlight. The agonizing ache of the severed wolf bond was entirely gone. It had been permanently banished from her body, replaced by a radiant, humming solar energy that filled her veins with liquid warmth. Across her delicate collarbones, faint, shimmering golden scales occasionally caught the light when she felt strong emotions, the physical manifestation of her supreme cosmic lineage rising to the surface. She paused beside a massive ancient stone trellis where a thick, withered vine clung desperately to the rock. The plant looked completely dead, its brittle branches grey and lifeless after decades of neglect. She did not think about the action. She simply operated on the pure, newly awakened instinct of her divine bloodline. Elyra reached out, her delicate fingers gently brushing the surface of the dry wood. The moment her skin made contact, a brilliant spark of molten golden fire transferred seamlessly from her fingertips into the vine. The reaction was instantaneous. The grey wood shifted to a deep, healthy brown. Vibrant emerald leaves unfurled rapidly along the trellis, followed immediately by the blooming of massive, fiery red blossoms that smelled of summer honey and warm rain. Elyra gasped softly, pulling her hand back and pressing it to her chest, her eyes wide with lingering wonder at the sheer magnitude of the life-giving magic she possessed. "You are bringing the ancient groves back to life," a deep, resonant voice murmured from the shadows of the archway. Elyra turned, a warm, genuine smile instantly softening her features. Valerin Drake stepped onto the garden path. The Dragon Emperor moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a colossal apex predator, yet every massive step he took was carefully calculated to ensure he did not startle her. He was clad in simple, dark obsidian tunics that highlighted his impossibly broad shoulders, his liquid gold eyes locked entirely on her face with an expression of unwavering, reverent devotion. He stopped exactly 3 paces away from her, firmly maintaining the respectful, non-coercive distance he had strictly observed since the night he pulled her from the ice. He was the most feared, destructive force in 3 realms. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered in the terrified rumors of the lower courts. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. Elyra looked at his harsh, predatory features, seeing only the absolute, unconditional safety he provided. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search the freezing snow for a broken outcast. Because monsters do not look at her as if she hung the very stars in the sky. "They were just sleeping," Elyra replied softly, gesturing to the blooming red flowers. "They just needed a little warmth to remind them how to grow." Valerin's gaze dropped slowly from her radiant face to the pronounced curve of her abdomen. The fierce, feral protectiveness that always simmered just beneath his calm exterior flared visibly in his golden eyes. He reached into the deep pocket of his dark silk tunic and withdrew a small, heavy object suspended on a chain of woven volcanic steel. It was the solar starstone, a warm, ancient amulet carved from raw, glowing golden obsidian, pulsating with a deep cosmic rhythm that instantly resonated with the magic humming in her veins. It was the highest relic of the Dragon Court, an artifact of unimaginable sovereign power. "This belongs to the true Empress of the Fire," Valerin murmured, his deep voice thick with overwhelming emotion. He did not step forward to place it around her neck, refusing to trap her in any physical boundary or assert unearned dominance. He simply held it out, resting the glowing stone on his massive, calloused palm. It will act as a natural focus for your awakening bloodline. It will protect the child when your own energy is depleted. Elyra looked at the priceless artifact, then up into the earnest, desperate eyes of the sovereign who was offering her an entire empire on his knees. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, entirely closing the cautious distance he had maintained. She reached out, but instead of taking the amulet, she placed her small, warm hand directly over his large, battle-scarred fingers, pressing his hand gently against the side of her swelling belly. Valerin froze completely. His breath hitched in his massive chest, his entire frame going rigidly still as the soft silk of her gown yielded beneath his palm. He was utterly terrified of pressing too hard, of breaking the fragile sanctuary they had built over the last 3 months. Right at that exact moment, the baby kicked. It was a strong, incredibly resilient flutter of life that struck directly against the center of Valerin's palm. The Dragon Emperor let out a ragged, breathless sound that was half gasp, half sob. He instantly dropped to his knees on the sunlit basalt path, his towering height crumbling entirely under the sheer emotional weight of the tiny movement. He pressed his forehead gently against the curve of her stomach, his massive shoulders trembling violently as he closed his eyes, weeping silently in the pure, unadulterated joy of protecting her. As his tears soaked into the pale gold silk of her gown, a powerful, undeniable somatic flare erupted through Elyra's nervous system. The old, faded claiming scar on her left wrist, the pale, lifeless crescent moon where the wolf bond had violently shattered, suddenly ignited. But it did not burn with the agonizing ice of betrayal. It glowed with a brilliant, blinding, molten gold light. The dragon's absolute devotion was actively overriding the trauma of her past, burning away the lingering shadows of her rejection and sealing her soul to a majestic, sovereign destiny. Elyra threaded her fingers gently through Valerin's long silver hair, looking out over the endless blue horizon of the sky-bound citadel. She felt the heavy, comforting weight of his presence anchoring her to the earth, the physical proof of her undeniable worth vibrating through every single cell of her newly awakened body. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought, the silent declaration echoing out toward the frozen, starving mountains of the north, because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The heavy granite walls of the Blackwood war room were completely encased in a thick, suffocating layer of hoarfrost. Draven Thornwood stood at the head of the massive carved table, his armored hands planted firmly against the frozen wood. His breath plumed in the stagnant air, joining the shivering exhales of his highest-ranking commanders. They looked less like elite warriors of a proud northern territory, and more like the desperate, hollowed-out survivors of a long, losing siege. The winter famine had stripped the muscle from their bones, leaving their faces gaunt and their eyes wild, with the primal panic of impending starvation. The heavy wooden doors violently swung open, and the lead border scout stumbled into the chamber. The man was covered head to toe in a thick crust of ice, his lips blue and his fingers trembling so violently he could barely hold his walking staff. He had been sent to the absolute edge of the territory, ordered to track the faint, impossible pulse of warmth that Draven had detected through the shattered remnants of his fated bond. "Speak," the Alpha King commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped painfully against the frozen stones. "Did you find the source? Did you find her?" The scout swallowed hard, his terrified gaze darting between the furious sovereign and the other commanders. He dropped to one knee, the joints of his frozen armor cracking sharply in the silence. "We tracked the thermal anomaly past the jagged ravines, Alpha. We followed it all the way to the vertical borders of the Obsidian peaks. The magic is not hidden in the valleys. It is radiating directly from the sky. Draven's jaw tightened, the cavernous void behind his ribs giving a violent, agonizing throb. The dragons, he breathed, the word carrying a heavy weight of ancient, bitter enmity. They took her. The winged beasts crossed into my territory and scavenged my property from the ice. Alpha, she is not a captive, the scout stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to banish the impossible image burned into his memory. The cloud cover broke for only a fraction of a minute. We saw the lower terraces of the floating citadel. The entire mountain below it is blooming with summer vegetation, and she, Elyra Vance, was standing on the grand balcony. She was draped in luminous silk, glowing with a golden light that blinded the naked eye. The dragon emperor himself was kneeling at her feet, offering her a goblet of water. The war room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The commanders stared at the scout, as if the man had entirely lost his mind to the winter delirium. A broken, defective Omega living in absolute, supreme luxury. A creature of myth kneeling before a servant girl who had been publicly discarded for her weakness. But Draven knew it was the truth. The agonizing, physical spasm in his chest confirmed it. The phantom warmth he had felt was not the lingering ghost of a dead mate. It was the radiant, thriving power of a woman who had finally been given the environment she needed to bloom. He had cast a dormant sun into the blizzard, and Valerin Drake had simply reached down and claimed the light for himself. A toxic, desperate jealousy clawed its way up the Alpha King's throat, completely overriding whatever fragments of rational leadership he still possessed. He did not feel remorse for driving a pregnant woman into a lethal storm. He felt the sheer, blinding entitlement of a ruler who realized his greatest weapon had been sitting in his own kitchen, and another man was now wielding it. Elyra had belonged to the Blackwood Pack. She had carried his heir. Her magic, her warmth, her very existence was his sovereign right by the strict laws of the ancestors. "They have stolen the spring," Draven announced, his voice rising in volume until it echoed violently off the frost-coated shields hanging on the walls. He turned his burning, bloodshot eyes toward his starving commanders, utilizing their desperation to fuel his own arrogant delusion. "The Dragon Court has descended into our lands and stolen the true Luna of this pack. They are using her fertility magic to hoard the warmth of the earth while our people freeze to death in the dark." The commanders shifted, the mention of stolen warmth igniting a primal, desperate fury in their hollow chests. "We do not roll over and die while winged lizards sit in the sun," the Alpha King roared, drawing his heavy broadsword from its scabbard. The rusted iron shrieked against the leather. "We march to the Obsidian Peaks. We shatter their gates. We drag my mate back down to the earth where she belongs. And we take back our survival." The men slammed their gauntlets against their breastplates, the chaotic, metallic clatter filling the chamber with the hollow sound of a doomed crusade. Draven turned his gaze toward the high, frosted windows, his winter storm eyes narrowing with absolute, unyielding obsession. Elyra thought she could simply disappear into the sky. She thought she could hide behind the massive wings of a myth. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. Within the hour, the Blackwood war party marched out of the frozen fortress. It was not a majestic military procession. It was a desperate, feral stampede of 300 starving wolves, their thick fur matted with snow, their eyes burning with the manic delusion that salvation waited for them at the top of the lethal mountain pass. Draven led the vanguard, his heavy boots crunching through the deep powder, his mind entirely consumed by the image of his discarded mate, wrapped in the golden warmth he was currently being denied. High above the crawling, desperate violence of the earth, the serene atmosphere of the Obsidian Fortress was suddenly pierced by a sound that shook the very foundation of the floating islands. It was a deep, resonant, and impossibly heavy drone, a blast from the ancient volcanic war horns carved into the highest towers of the citadel. The sound did not merely echo. It vibrated through the basalt floors, rattling the crystal goblets in the dining halls and sending a visible ripple through the azure clouds below. Elyra stood in the center of her sunlit chamber, her hands instinctively coming to rest protectively over the pronounced curve of her abdomen. The ambient, humming heat of the room instantly shifted in character. It was no longer just a soothing, medicinal warmth. It flared into a sharp, defensive radiance, the ancient magic of the fortress actively responding to an external threat. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the Dragon Emperor strode into the room. The gentle, reverent man who had wept against her stomach only hours ago was entirely gone. In his place stood the apex predator, the lethal sovereign of the skies. He was fully clad in his terrifying molten gold battle armor, the heavy interlocking plates glowing faintly with residual heat. A massive obsidian hilted broadsword was strapped across his broad back. His silver hair was braided tightly against his skull, and his liquid gold eyes burned with a feral, uncompromising violence that completely swallowed his pupils. Yet, the moment he crossed the threshold and locked eyes with her, the lethal tension in his massive frame visibly softened. He stopped exactly 3 paces away, maintaining the strict, respectful boundary he had sworn never to cross without her permission. An armed war party has crossed into the lower mountain pass, Valerin stated, his deep, rumbling voice deliberately pitched low to avoid startling her. The Blackwood wolves are attempting to scale the vertical glass borders. Their alpha is leading the vanguard. He is shouting your name at the stone, demanding that his property be returned. The words hit Elyra like a sudden blast of cold air, a phantom echo of the agonizing blizzard she had barely survived. For a fraction of a second, the ingrained instincts of a discarded Omega flared in her mind. Her pulse stuttered, and her shoulders hunched defensively. The urge to flee, to hide in the deepest, darkest corner of the fortress, and pray the terrifying Alpha King would simply go away, pulled violently at her consciousness. Valerin saw the shadow cross her delicate features. He took a half-step forward, his golden eyes filled with an absolute, unwavering protective vow. "You do not need to hear his voice," the Emperor murmured, his tone as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. "The lower vaults of this citadel are sealed behind walls of pure magma. No creature of the earth can survive the heat. I will personally escort you down to the sanctuary chambers, and you can rest safely in the quiet while I descend to the border. I will remove his head, scatter his starving pack, and ensure that the name Draven Thornwood never reaches your ears again." It was the ultimate offer of protection. It was the absolute safety she had craved her entire life. She could simply step away, let the legendary dragon handle the monster who had broken her, and never have to face the agonizing reality of her past. Elyra looked down at her chest. The solar starstone rested heavily against her sternum, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic heat that perfectly matched her own heartbeat. She felt a strong, resilient kick against the inside of her womb, a quiet reminder of the tiny life that had miraculously survived the ice. She looked at the smooth, faded crescent scar on her left wrist, no longer a gaping wound of rejection, but a closed chapter overridden by the blinding gold of her own newly awakened power. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the ambient solar magic of the room fill her expanding lungs. The phantom chill of the Blackwood altar completely dissolved, burned away by the supreme, dormant lineage roaring to life in her veins. "No," Elyra said. Her voice was not loud. It was not aggressive or arrogant. It was incredibly quiet, carrying the heavy, terrifying restraint of a woman who had finally realized her own undeniable magnitude. Valerin tilted his head slightly, his golden eyes widening in silent, reverent surprise. "If I hide in the vaults, I am still the frightened servant girl who ran into the snow," she continued, lifting her chin to meet the Emperor's burning gaze. "If you kill him for me while I cower in the dark, Draven will die believing he still owns me. He will die believing I am a defective, helpless thing that needed a bigger monster to save her." She stepped forward, entirely closing the distance between them. She reached out, her small, warm fingers gently brushing against the searing hot metal of his golden breastplate. "I am not property to be stolen back. I am not a secret to be locked away. I will not hide from a man who threw me into the ice." A low, awe-struck rumble vibrated deep within Valerin's massive chest. The feral violence in his eyes shifted immediately into a look of absolute, breathtaking adoration. He slowly sank to one knee, the heavy armor clanking against the basalt floor, and bowed his head in complete submission to her choice. "As my Empress commands," he whispered fiercely, "the sky is yours to rule." The next hour was a meticulous, transformative ritual of absolute sovereignty. Gwyneth Cole and a procession of high-caste dragon handmaidens entered the chamber, carrying garments that defied the harsh, utilitarian constraints of the wolf territories. They did not dress her in coarse linen or the heavy, suffocating animal pelts designed to merely survive the cold. They dressed her for ascension. Elyra was draped in layers of the finest, weightless volcanic silk, dyed in vibrant shades of deep crimson and blinding, pale gold. The fabric felt like a second skin, radiating a gentle, perpetual warmth that perfectly insulated her pregnant body. Intricate, heavy embroidery woven from pure spun gold cascaded down the bodice, depicting ancient solar flares and rising dragons. Gwyneth carefully pinned her thick, silver hair back with heavy obsidian combs, allowing the natural, glowing golden scales along the young woman's collarbones to remain completely visible. Finally, the heavy solar starstone was arranged perfectly over the center of her chest, pulsing like a captured star against the rich crimson silk. When she turned to face the tall, crystal mirror in the corner of the room, she did not recognize the reflection staring back at her. The bruised, exhausted, and hopelessly invisible Omega was dead. In her place stood a supreme, celestial sovereign, a vessel of divine fire, who carried the undeniable weight of an empire in her posture. She walked out of the chamber, her bare feet pressing confidently against the warm basalt floors. The heavy double doors of the grand corridor were thrown wide open. Rows of elite, armored dragon guards lined the massive halls. As she passed, these terrifying winged warriors did not merely stand at attention. They dropped to their knees in perfect, rippling unison, bowing their heads not out of fear, but out of profound, instinctual reverence for the immense solar magic actively humming in her blood. Valerin walked exactly half a step behind her right shoulder. It was a deliberate, powerful visual reversal of the agonizing night at the pack altar, where Draven had forced her to walk behind him as a lesser being. The Dragon Emperor did not lead her. He guarded her flank, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising lethal force directed at anyone who dared to look upon her with disrespect. The grand obsidian ramparts of the fortress jutted out over the endless abyss, a sheer, terrifying drop of thousands of feet to the frozen earth below. The glass-like stone was completely transparent near the edge, offering an unobstructed view of the violent snowstorms raging at the base of the mountains. Elyra stepped up to the massive stone balustrade, the high-altitude winds whipping her crimson and gold silks around her legs, though the ambient heat of her blood kept the chill entirely at bay. She looked down through the swirling grey clouds. Far below, struggling against the impenetrable vertical cliffs of the dragon border, was a tiny, pathetic swarm of black dots. It was the mighty Blackwood war party. They were hacking desperately at the smooth glass walls with rusted swords, their miserable, frozen howls barely carrying up through the howling wind. From this majestic height, the Alpha King and his terrifying wolves looked exactly like what they truly were. Small, insignificant creatures completely bound to the dirt, angrily shouting at the sky because they could not reach the sun. The Alpha King tipped his head back, his winter storm eyes frantically searching the sheer, impossible altitude of the glass cliffs. Through the violently swirling snow and the suffocating grey clouds, a sudden fracture of sunlight broke across the sky. Draven Thornwood stopped hacking at the impenetrable stone. The rusted broadsword slipped from his freezing fingers, landing in the deep powder with a dull, pathetic thud. High above, standing on the grand obsidian balcony that seemed to float among the heavens, was a vision that completely shattered his arrogant reality. It was Elyra. She was no longer the quiet, bruised servant who had scrubbed the blood from his pack's training floors. She was draped in layers of luminous, weightless silk that caught the high-altitude sun, glowing with a blinding, celestial fire. Even from thousands of feet below, Draven could see the pronounced curve of her abdomen, the undeniable proof that his heir had survived the lethal blizzard, and standing exactly half a step behind her, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising lethality, was the colossal figure of Valerin Drake. The Emperor of the Skies was fully armored in molten gold, his massive hand resting protectively near the small of her back. He was not restraining her. He was anchoring her, a silent guardian, allowing her to claim her own power. A toxic, suffocating wave of desperate entitlement clawed its way up Draven's frozen throat. He was the sovereign of the Northern Territories. He possessed the ancestral right to command. He filled his lungs with the biting winter air and unleashed the full, dominating force of his Alpha command, a sonic roar designed to force any lower-caste wolf directly to their knees in absolute submission. Elyra! Draven screamed, his voice tearing through the howling wind, laced with manic delusion and feral greed. "You belong to the Blackwood Pack. You carry my bloodline. Step away from that winged beast and return to the earth. I demand you come back to me." The agonizing shout echoed up the vertical face of the mountain, carrying the sheer, pathetic desperation of a ruler who had finally realized he was starving to death. The sound was ugly, a grating noise that belonged to the mud and the ice. Standing on the grand ramparts, Elyra Vance felt the faint vibration of his voice strike the magical barrier of the floating citadel. Months ago, that commanding tone would have sent a paralyzing spike of terror through her nervous system. It would have forced her to bow her head, to submit to his cruelty in desperate pursuit of a safety that never truly existed. Now the sound simply washed over her like a weak, dying breeze. The faint crescent scar on her left wrist did not burn with the agonizing ice of the severed bond. Instead, the solar starstone resting heavily against her sternum pulsed with a steady, rhythmic heat, filling her veins with liquid, golden warmth. She felt absolutely nothing for the frantic monster screaming in the snow. The silence in her heart was profound, absolute, and entirely liberating. She stepped closer to the edge of the transparent balustrade. She did not raise her voice to compete with the howling storm. She simply allowed the ancient, divine magic humming within her blood to carry her words on the ambient thermal currents descending from the massive floating fortress. "I belong to the shadows," she stated, her voice impossibly calm, echoing clearly across the frozen valley below like a ringing celestial bell. "I belong to the cold, and I belong to a man who threw me away because he could not recognize the sun. I carry no wolf heir. The child I protect belongs to the sky." Draven's gaunt face twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. To be openly defied by a discarded Omega before his entire starving war party was the ultimate desecration of his pride. His chest heaved as he turned wildly to his shivering commanders, his eyes bloodshot and crazed. "Bring her down," he roared, drawing a secondary hunting dagger from his belt. "Shatter the pillars. Burn the stone. I will not leave this mountain without my property." The Blackwood warriors hesitated. They looked at their manic ruler, then up at the terrifying, glowing sovereign standing beside the woman they had all mercilessly mocked. They were starving, their limbs numb with frostbite, entirely lacking the strength to even lift their rusted weapons. The cold had hollowed them out, leaving only the bitter realization of their own impending doom. Elyra looked down at the chaotic, scrambling violence of her former tormentors. A deep, resonant breath filled her lungs. "Thank you for letting me go," she whispered into the crisp azure sky. because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. She raised her delicate hands, pressing her palms flat against the invisible, magical barrier protecting the ramparts. The moment her skin made contact, her supreme cosmic lineage fully awakened. A blinding, rippling wave of molten golden light erupted from the solar starstone on her chest, cascading down her bare arms and shooting straight down the sheer vertical face of the mountain. It was not a destructive, consuming fire meant to burn flesh and bone. It was the pure, absolute authority of the sun, a restorative but unyielding elemental force. The massive wave of heat hit the base of the cliffs with a deafening, hissing explosion. The thick layers of hoarfrost covering the Blackwood warriors instantly vaporized into thick clouds of white steam. Draven gasped, stumbling backward as the sudden, overwhelming temperature shift hit his frozen armor. Within seconds, the rusted iron swords, the heavy battle axes, and the cruel hunting daggers clutched in the wolves' hands began to glow a bright, cherry red. The weapons grew unbearably hot. With terrified shouts, the warriors dropped their blades into the deep snow. The moment the metal struck the ground, it melted completely, dissolving into useless, bubbling pools of liquid slag. The heavy iron gauntlets on Draven's hands hissed violently, forcing the Alpha King to desperately tear them off before they fused to his skin, leaving his hands raw and blistered. The heat did not stop there. It seeped deep into the permafrost beneath their heavy boots, turning the jagged, frozen earth into a torrential flood of warm, thick mud. The majestic, terrifying war party of the north was instantly stripped of its fangs, reduced to a crowd of disarmed, exhausted men struggling to stay upright in a swamp of their own making. The sheer display of primordial power was undeniable. Draven fell to his knees in the steaming mud, his raw, blistered hands shook uncontrollably as he stared at the melted ruin of his ancestral dagger. He looked up, his winter storm eyes wide with the crushing, undeniable reality of his absolute defeat. He could not fight the sun. He could not reclaim a woman who had ascended to the heavens while he remained hopelessly chained to the dirt. Around him, the commanders of the Blackwood Pack made their choice. They did not rally to their fallen king. They looked at the shivering, pathetic man kneeling in the mud, realizing that his arrogant cruelty had doomed their entire territory to a perpetual, freezing famine. Without a single word, the lead scout turned his back on the sovereign. One by one, the starving warriors abandoned their ruined weapons and began the long, miserable trudge back toward the dying valleys. They left Draven completely alone, kneeling in the ruins of his own shattered empire, consumed by the agonizing chill of his own making. High above, Elyra lowered her hands. The brilliant golden light slowly receded, pulling the intense heat back into the protective wards of the floating citadel. She watched the tiny black dot of the Alpha King shrink into the distance as the grey clouds rolled back in, permanently sealing the border. The past was entirely gone. It was nothing but a faded nightmare, washed away by the rising dawn. Valerin stepped forward, completely closing the respectful distance he had maintained. He did not speak. The massive dragon simply wrapped his incredibly warm, armored arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his broad chest. Elyra leaned into his solid strength, resting her head against his shoulder. The chaotic adrenaline of the confrontation faded, replaced by the profound, unwavering safety of his embrace. His steady heartbeat was the rhythm of her new world, a relentless drum of protection and absolute devotion. "It is finished," Valerin murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her spine. "The earth will never touch you again." She turned in his arms, looking up into the liquid gold eyes of the man who had traded his terrifying reputation for the chance to simply hold her. She reached up, gently tracing the harsh, predatory angle of his jawline. "Take me inside," she answered softly. "I want to go home." Valerin gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her away from the crystal balcony and deep into the heart of the floating citadel. The heavy obsidian doors sealed shut behind them, completely cutting off the last howling echoes of the northern winter. Inside their private chambers, the air was instantly filled with the soothing scent of blooming summer roses and warm volcanic stone. Elyra rested her hand over her swelling stomach, leaning into the steady heartbeat of her fated mate as they watched the horizon settle into a brilliant, unblemished expanse of gold. The terror was truly over. They were finally completely safe. 2 months later, the Obsidian Court celebrated a transition of power that would be sung about in the high halls for 10,000 years. The grand throne room of the floating fortress was a breathtaking cathedral of dark volcanic glass and cascading summer blossoms. Thousands of elite dragon lords, high caste healers, and winged sentinels gathered in absolute, reverent silence. Sunlight poured through the vaulted ceiling, bathing the ancient stone in a soft, ethereal radiance. Elyra walked slowly down the central aisle, the long train of her crimson coronation gown gliding effortlessly over the polished basalt floor. She was 7 months pregnant, her body practically humming with a vibrant, visible solar energy that illuminated the grand chamber. She did not walk with her head bowed. She did not shrink from the intense, evaluating gaze of the nobility. She moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a woman who had survived the deepest ice and learned exactly how to wield her own fire. Every step was a testament to her survival, a silent declaration that the servant girl was dead, replaced by a radiant queen. At the end of the day stood Valerin Drake. The emperor wore his formal ceremonial robes of spun gold and deep black silk, looking every bit the lethal, primordial beast that legends claimed him to be. Yet, as the fragile survivor approached the ancient throne, the most powerful male in 3 realms stepped down from the dais. He did not wait for her to bow. He sank to one knee before the entire gathered court, lowering his silver head in a gesture of absolute, unhesitating submission. A collective gasp rippled through the nobility, but Valerin did not care. His pride belonged entirely to her. Gwyneth Cole, the chief healer, stepped forward holding a heavy crown forged from raw, glowing obsidian and pure starlight. With trembling, joyful hands, the older woman placed the ancient artifact gently upon Elyra's silver hair. The crown settled with a comforting weight, radiating a soothing warmth that resonated perfectly with the solar starstone resting against her chest. "I present to you, Elyra," Gwyneth announced, her voice ringing clearly through the cavernous hall. The vessel of the sun, the mother of the golden dawn, and the undisputed queen of the skies. The roar of approval from the dragon nobility was deafening. It was a physical, concussive wave of joyous sound that shook the very foundation of the floating islands. Elyra looked down at the kneeling giant before her. She took his massive, scarred hand and gently urged him to his feet. Valerin rose, his golden eyes shining with an overwhelming, absolute devotion. He kissed the back of her knuckles, leading her up the final steps to rule beside him, equal in power, equal in love, and forever untouchable. The final culmination of their majestic recovery arrived as the high summer winds swept across the azure sky. Deep within the most secure, fiercely guarded sanctuary chambers of the fortress, the air was thick with the scent of sweet sage and warm cedar. There was no chaotic panic, no screaming, and no fear. There was only the intense, rhythmic pulsing of ancient magic operating exactly as the universe intended. Elyra lay back against the mountain of soft silk pillows, her face flushed with exertion, but her eyes incredibly bright. The physical toll of the labor was entirely mitigated by the ambient, humming heat of the volcanic walls and the steady, grounding presence of Valerin sitting right beside her. He held her hand with terrified, breathless care, his massive frame trembling slightly as he poured his own limitless energy into her exhausted muscles. The fated bond between them burned with a magnificent, golden intensity, transferring his strength directly into her body to shield her from the pain. Gwyneth worked with quiet, practiced efficiency at the foot of the bed. after a final, powerful surge of solar magic illuminated the room, washing the dark stone walls in brilliant, blinding light. The beautiful, melodic sound of a newborn's first cry filled the chamber. It did not sound like the feral whimper of a wolf pup. It sounded like a tiny resonant chime, a spark of pure life claiming its rightful place in the world. "A son," Gwyneth whispered, her eyes crinkling with profound joy as she gently wrapped the squirming infant in a soft, heated blanket. A perfect, impossibly strong son. Gwyneth walked around the edge of the massive bed and carefully placed the bundled child onto Elyra's chest. Elyra let out a ragged, breathless laugh, tears of absolute joy spilling over her eyelashes as she looked down at the tiny miracle she had carried through the lethal snowstorm. The baby possessed a tuft of thick, silver hair, but as he slowly blinked his eyes open, the irises were not the cold winter grey of the northern packs. They were burning, liquid, molten gold. He carried the undeniable lineage of the sun. He was the living, breathing proof that her quiet resilience had triumphed over every shadow, trying to consume them. He was a creature of the sky, untouched by the frost and the cruelty that had once tried to define her existence. Valerin leaned over, his harsh features completely undone by the sheer magnitude of the moment. He reached out with a single, trembling finger, gently stroking the soft cheek of the golden-eyed infant. The massive, terrifying beast wept openly, the tears tracking silently down his face as he buried his face in Elyra's neck, inhaling the sweet, warm scent of his growing family. The man who had once been feared as a ruthless destroyer was now entirely consumed by a love so profound it shattered the very foundations of his soul. "You saved us," Valerin murmured against her skin, his voice thick with a reverence that words could barely contain. "You mended the entire world." Elyra rested her cheek against his silver hair, wrapping her arms protectively around the tiny, radiant life resting above her heart. The solar starstone pulsed softly against her collarbone, a quiet, eternal heartbeat of pure light. Outside the arched windows, the endless blue sky stretched forever toward the horizon, unmarred by clouds or cold. The freezing altars of the past were nothing but ash in the wind, long forgotten and stripped of all their power. The biggest forces in the world had tried to break her, to strip her of her worth and leave her in the dark. But sitting in the profound, quiet warmth of her chosen sanctuary, Elyra knew the ultimate truth. It was the small, silent, enduring acts of love that held the power to mend the universe.